I'd like to focus in this next lesson in Fireworking 301 on something which I consider to be very important. The careful and successful pumping of color stars and then priming them, drying them and then priming them. I have weighed a 100 gram batch of NX01 Red Star. This is a very brilliant, pure red composition that makes a real brilliant, bright red star. I've weighed the individual chemicals. I'm going to screen them through this little 30 to 40 mesh kitchen strainer. A lot of the steps, some of these steps were sort of shown when we pumped the little half-inch red stars to embed in the color-changing comets in one of the last lessons. But I'd like to focus a little more on pumping and priming color stars. I want to double check my composition weight, make sure I didn't forget anything or make any mistakes in weighing. I would normally be doing this outdoors, but for demonstration purposes I'll do it in here. 100 grams on the money. I'll screen that one more time, shake it, and it'll be ready to dampen and pump. One thing that can be very illustrative, I know this composition and I know it's working very well, but when trying a new composition or trying new chemicals in a composition, it can be very educational and informative to take a teaspoon of the composition outside, lay a little line of it on a brick, put a piece of Visco in it, maybe weigh down the Visco with a rock so it doesn't blow away under its own propulsive force, and burn it. See how fast it burns, see what kind of color it burns in. That can show you a lot about whether, well, that lid's kind of shot. That can show you a lot about whether a composition is right or not. Like I say, I know these chemicals, I know this composition. I'll take a line out there, put a piece of Visco in there. Burns fairly rapidly with a very brilliant red, bright red coloration, even in the daytime. I've got my denatured alcohol. That's mixed up very well there, shaken. I want to dampen this with about 5% denatured alcohol. I know that is about 35 squirts or so with my little atomizer bottle. I'll dampen the top layer, shift it around, dampen the top layer, shift it around. I want to distribute this alcohol as much as possible right during this process. There's 20. 20 gave me 2 grams of alcohol. $30 gave me 4 grams of alcohol. $35 sticks at 4. And there's 5 grams of the alcohol. I want to put this through my, it's about a 16 mesh sieve kitchen colander to distribute that alcohol evenly. And then I'll be ready to pump with that. I'm going to show a little different way of pumping these stars, which is a very precise way to do it. As opposed to pumping them extra long and trimming them, I'm actually going to weigh the composition for each star. I find that to be about as effective as pumping them long, trimming them, and having to re-granulate the already pumped composition that I've trimmed off. This to me works nice and quickly and efficiently. I have already figured out that each 3/4 inch star, which I'm going to pump, takes about 10 grams of composition to pump a 3/4 inch long star. So I'll weigh 10 grams of this composition. There's 10 grams. 10 grams, a heaping 1/2 tablespoon makes about 10 grams for me. I've trimmed, like I did with other stars and comets, I've trimmed a funnel which fits into the 3/4 inch star plate nice and snug. Put that composition into the funnel, tamp it down, move on to the next one. I'll do that until all the holes, this is just a 4-hole star plate of Caleb's, but I'll do that until all the holes are filled. Goes pretty quickly. This composition, these phenolic resin alcohol wetted compositions, whether it's just the phenolic resin in there or if it's some of the other chemicals as well, even though all the color compositions have phenolic resin in them, I notice some are stickier than others. This one's a little sticky. Some of them are stickier than others, and they will tend to stick to the walls of the star pump and get wedged a little bit between the pins and the holes in the star plate. So I'm going to show a little trick to avoid a problem with that. First of all, I use a 3/4 inch dowel or a 3/4 inch rammer, and I flatten out the composition in there. Now if I pumped this just as is right now, after a pumping, a little bit of that gummy composition would get up between the hole and the pins, and it makes it very difficult to remove the rammer. It's not damaging the rammer, it's just sort of gluing the parts together. I have what do I want to say? I punched some 3/4 inch thin discs. I think this is out of cereal box paper. I know Caleb can cut discs to any size we want. He could cut some 3/4 inch discs for you, 1/16 inch thick, or whatever the diameter of the star jar you're pumping, 1 inch or 1/2 inch. But I put one disc in each of the holes. These discs, which is the Steve Kersinski solution, the Steve Kerr solution, these discs will push, these are snug in the hole, they push the composition down, sort of wiping and cleaning all the composition down as it goes, prevents any composition from working up between the pins and the holes. That keeps this gummy composition from binding the parts of the pump together, plate together. If there was fine metals in there like ferrotitanium or spherical titanium, that would avoid having those metals come up between the holes and the pins in the star plate parts, which can potentially damage a star plate. So this Steve Kerr solution works very well to prevent any of that. I have determined that 1,500 pounds per square inch on these color comps works nice to consolidate them, and they don't require much dwell time. On a 4-hole plate, 1,500 pounds per square inch, I actually need about 2,600 pounds of force. I've marked P2F on my big arbor press. I've showed you in the small arbor press article how to exert 2,500 pounds of force with the bag of gravel. So if you were using your small, inexpensive 1-ton arbor press, you could do the same thing. I'm going to use my large 6-ton arbor press. But I've got a mark on my P2F gauge at 2,600 pounds of force. I apply that amount of force, hold it there for a couple seconds, and those stars are now pumped. I said it's sticky. The stars can stick a little bit to the 1/2 inch plate I'm pumping on, so instead of just pulling the star plate off, this came loose pretty easily. I'll actually try to slide sideways just a little bit to break any bond that the stars might have created between the plate and the end of the stars. And then to eject these, I use my 3/4 inch rammer dead center in the star plate between the stars, and I press the stars out of the plate. all of this can be adapted to your own processes and techniques, but I'm trying to give you an idea of what might be necessary to do when pumping these color stars. Now, they are sticky compositions just a little bit. A knife can separate the discs from the stars without damaging that surface at that end of the stars. And so there's 4 nice stars. Obviously this operation, once you get into it, turn your radio on, listen to some Crystal Method like Tom Rebencloud does. Obviously this process starts to go pretty quickly. Those 10 grams per star with this particular composition ended up with stars that are just maybe a 32nd or 64th more than 3/4 inches, but they're very, very close. And I will continue to pump stars and use up my composition. Obviously the 100 grams of composition that I made is going to pump 10 stars. If I have 20 grams left and want to pump just 2 stars, I'll fill 2 of the holes and I'll use half as much force when I press them. So there are 4 stars pumped. I will dry these in the hot box at 100 to 120 to 150 degrees. These will dry overnight. The alcohol gets cooked out of them very quickly and easily. And then I'll show you how to prime these stars. They do require priming as opposed to the comets, the Chrysanthemum 6, the glitter comets that we've made already. Those compositions don't require priming. They catch fire as easily as black powder does. These don't take fire, especially out of a fairly hard broken shell. They don't take fire as easily, so they need a layer of easily ignited prime that will transfer fire to the star composition. And I will show how to prime these stars once they're dry. It is certainly possible to go back to the pump, fill the star plate completely, press the stars, use the eject spacers to eject the excess length and trim that excess off, and then regranulate that pumped excess length through the screen, which is very easy to do. It's easy to go back to that method when filling a star plate, especially a large star plate that has 49 stars or so. I don't mind weighing and doing this and avoiding the excess of the trimming, the ejection of the excess and then the trimming of the excess star length. I don't really mind weighing and pressing stars like this, especially if I'm not doing thousands of stars. If I'm doing 100 stars, I don't mind doing it this way. Since I added the 5 grams of alcohol to this composition, the composition started off at 100 grams. I should have enough after I pump 8 of these stars. I should have enough to pump 2 more with maybe 5 grams left over. We'll see. Each time I use a disc, I like to make sure it's clearing of any debris from the last pressing. Usually the excess composition chips off pretty easily. But I can't overemphasize how much trouble these discs prevents. The lodging of metals between the pins and the holes, the avoidance of getting that gummy comp up between the pins and the holes and binding the star plate parts together. These discs just make this process so easy. I'll actually weigh my remaining composition to make sure I've got the 20 grams I need. Yeah, I've got 19, there's a little left. That's in here. I have 20 grams on the money. So now what I'll do is introduce, I'll go catty corner across the plate to even the stresses out on the plate. One option to fill the plate completely that can work kind of slick is to actually take two. Actually, I'll show you doing that. What the heck? I could take these 2 stars. I've got 11 grams in there. I'll take a gram out. There we go. I could, right now, I've put the composition in 2 holes catty corner to each other. I can put the pin plate in there and press this at half the pressure I was using before. Sometimes that's a little clunky to do with a star plate that has a whole lot of holes in it. So what I can do is actually take 2 of the stars that I've already pumped. I know I need to fill 2 more holes, and these, once after they're pumped until they're dry, they're pretty crumbly. I can just granulate 2 stars through my 16 mesh screen, and now that's regranulated. I can use that to fill my remaining 2 holes. That comes in especially handy if I have, say, 3 holes empty in my 49 star plate that I need to fill in order to complete the filling of a star plate, and I want to avoid any uneven warping stresses on the plate when I press it. Crumbling 3 stars to fill those extra 3 holes is obviously an easy thing to do. Let's make sure I've got 10 grams from that other star, that I've got 9 grams there. I'll call that close enough. There's no comp left in either of these tubs. There is a little. I'll use the remaining comp in that tub. And so there I've completely used that batch of composition that I dampened. I'll dry these overnight in the drying box, and then I'll show how I prime these stars next. The priming process is especially critical when we're pumping or making in another type of process like rolling or cutting. When we're making a star that is not easily ignited, like a color star or a willow star, very important to know how to prime them. I will say something I just noticed I wasn't doing. Yesterday I was pumping with the star plate on a 1/2-inch plate with the P2F gauge on top of the plate, which was distributing the forces to the top of the plate. Well, I just noticed that I was using the P2F gauge under the plate with this sitting on it. I was then, here, I'll show you what I was doing. I was then pressing without a plate on top of it. I usually like to put a sacrificial plate on top of the star plate like this, just a 1/2-inch plate that completely covers the surface of the star plate to further distribute the forces over it. I figure this pin plate has holes drilled most of the way through it, so in places that plate's pretty thin and probably pretty easily warped. So what I would really normally be doing, what I prefer to do, is when I'm actually pumping the stars, I'll put a sacrificial plate on top of the star plate to really reinforce that top pin plate surface and distribute the forces evenly. So don't do what I did, do what I say. So there's 10 nice red stars. I will dry. Another instructive thing you can do even when they're damp like this, I'll put on a welder's glove or a fireplace glove, a heavy leather glove, light one of these with a torch and throw it. They don't light really, really fast when they're damp like this, and throw it up in the air to see what the color is going to look like. That can be another instructive way to see what kind of color we're getting out of the stars, as long as I'm well far away from anything that's flammable when I do that. One thing I would add to this particular project, using these phenolic resin, alcohol-bound compositions, cleanup is most easily done with the same solvent, the denatured alcohol. I just spritz the star plate, the tooling, the tub, the screens with a little bit of the denatured alcohol and just wipe them off. Denatured alcohol resoftens any of the crumblies that were left on anything and cleans them up, whereas water wouldn't. Water won't soften that composition once it's been bound with the phenolic resin and alcohol. So cleanup is easily done with just some spritzing of the alcohol and wiping down with a rag or paper towel. One thing, I may actually forget to mention it tomorrow when we prime those stars that are drying. Prime accomplishes three things to me that the way I envision it. Prime hits the surface of the star and lights it fast. Prime is a very flammable, almost black powder composition which lights fast and easy and lights very rapidly. It keeps the stars lit. The stars, as they're flown out of a mine or a shell, are traveling very rapidly. Prime hangs on to its fire and is not blown blind easily. It keeps the stars lit. And it also very rapidly lights all the surfaces of the star, not just one corner, not just one end. Distributes the fire to all the surfaces of the star rapidly and thoroughly, and gets the whole star surface burning at the same time, so the star is burning in toward the center evenly. And if that's done for each and every star, then each star will burn for the same duration, burn out almost simultaneously. It's important for a good-looking starburst that the stars burn for the same amount of time and then burn out at the same time. Good prime distributes the fire to all the surfaces of each star and has them all burning toward the center, and hopefully burning for the same duration and burning out at the same time. The red color stars I pumped yesterday are now good and dry. They've been in the drying box overnight. I used a couple for something else, but I still got 6 here to prime. These are stars that have the dry prime that I'm about to apply to these on all of their surfaces. The prime dries very hard, but also sort of lumpy and rough. It really takes fire and holds fire very easily. This is kind of my go-to prime. This is the Color Star prime in the formulas section. It's essentially a hard break prime plus some 100 mesh magnesium and some fine silicon. The magnesium silicon melt or burn hot as the prime is burning, so it transfers fire and really makes fire cling nicely, especially to color stars out of a nice shell break. This prime in, but I'll use this prime for just about any star that needs priming. So far we've made glitter, comets, chrysanthemum 6 comets. Those light so easily they don't need priming. But when we get down into tiger tail stars, willow stars, color stars, those stars do need prime in order to take fire and hold fire well out of a mine or a shell burst. So I'm going to prime these in a couple different ways. One factor when it comes to priming, these are alcohol phenolic resin bound stars. They won't soften when they get wet. If I had made some pumped tiger tail or willow stars with dextrin, those will soften if they get wet. The dextrin reactivates, resoftens. Those stars will soften some when they get wet with the Toro slurry I'm about to use. So I have to be careful not to have them wet for too long while I'm handling them and tumbling them, or else some of the corners will start to round off and actually chip. They can chip off, bust off. So if I am binding a charcoal star such as tiger tail or willow, a willow diadem. You'll see in the actual Japanese formulas in Dr. Shimage's fast that he recommends using SGRS, soluble glutinous rice starch, as the binder instead of dextrin. The advantage of soluble glutinous rice starch is it doesn't reactivate easily. If a charcoal star bound with SGRS is wet with taro and tumbled, it won't soften quickly and easily. It is not as susceptible to getting wet and resoftening as a dextrin-bound star is. So I will typically try to use SGRS binding in willow or tiger tail stars that will be primed in the method I'm about to describe. These are the dry stars unprimed. These are the dry stars primed. The way I'm about to show in the tumbling or rolling these in the Toro slurry and then putting dry prime on them, that increases the height and the diameter of the star about a 1/16 inch. The coating is about a 32nd inch thick. It's a little lumpy, so it can vary from place to place, but overall a 1/32 inch thick layer there, 1/32 inch layer on the other side increases the diameter by a 1/16 of an inch. These have gone from a 3/4 inch star up to a 13/16 inch diameter star. So when I'm calculating how many of these will fit in a ring, say in a cylinder shell, I've got to account for about an increase in diameter of about a 1/16 of an inch, and also an increase in height of the star by about a 1/16 of an inch, 1/32 and 1/32. I'm going to show two different ways of priming these dry red stars. But first I've got to mix up some prime. I have screen mixed a 1 kilogram, 1,000 gram batch of the color star prime. This just has fine potassium nitrate. None of this is ball milled. I want prime to burn sort of slow and slaggy. Fine potassium nitrate, commercial mixed hardwood airfloat charcoal, sulfur and dextrin, the 100 mesh magnesium, and the silicon metal. And that has simply been screened a couple times, shaken together for a good homogeneously mixed prime composition that's dry. I then want to make a slurry with that for the wet part of this priming. I already have a little slurry mixed up, but I need a little more. I have in the star formula page, I have specifications for how to mix up the prime slurry, and then about how much of that will be used on certain batches of stars. Calculating the surface area of the stars can give us a rough idea of how much of this prime we will use in any given batch. For example, to prime 100 3/4 inch stars, pumped stars, 3/4 inch tall, to prime 100 of those, they weighed 1,000 grams. Each star weighs about 10 grams dry. That used 145 grams of the Toro slurry, of which about 100 grams was the actual dry mix. The rest was water. And then they picked up, when I tumbled them in the dry comp, they picked up about 90 grams of the dry comp. So about 200 grams total of the dry comp between the Toro slurry and the dry comp that was added second. About 200 grams of the prime total ended up on 1,000 grams of the 3/4 inch stars. That will vary some if we vary the size of the star, so I do have a calculator in here for how much prime will be picked up per square inch of surface area of stars, if you want to do a little math. Bottom line is, for mixing the slurry, I want to add 43 grams of water to each 100 grams of the prime comp to make a slurry. I'll show you about the thickness I'm shooting for there. So I want to add 100 grams of the dry prime comp to what I already have in this tub. And that's 1/4 cup, weighed about 46 grams. So about a half cup of this weighs 100 grams. There I've got 90 grams. There I've got 100 grams of the dry added to the Toro bucket. I never add one chemical on top of another in case I overshoot it. So I want to weigh, actually I'll get a little, well, I can do that. I want to weigh 43 grams of water and add it to that. That way if I'm adding water to the empty cup, if I ever shoot it, I can just remove some. There's 43 grams. Naturally, if this gets a little thin, I can add a little more dry comp. If it gets a little thick, I can add a little. If it stays a little too thick, I can add a little more water. I want to stir this. Initially, it's a little tricky to stir the dry powder into the water because of surface tension. But once the comp starts to pick up the water, it gets a little easier to do. The magnesium and silicon, the solids in this, including the charcoal, but mostly the heavier solids, the magnesium and silicon, can try to settle out of the comp over time. So as I'm using it, I stir it every now and then. This is mixing into a sludge now. What I'm looking for is a comp thickness. It's thicker than heavy cream, it's thinner than honey, it's less sticky than honey. The pancake batter can vary in thickness depending on whether you're making thick buttermilk pancakes or Swedish pancakes. A little difficult to describe the thickness other than to say, mixing it with this tongue depressor, if I pick some up, it drips off, but it stops dripping when I have about a good heavy 1/16 inch coating adhering to the tongue depressor. So you can visualize about how thick this is that way. It's not like water or heavy cream where it runs off completely. It's not thick like honey or peanut butter or sour cream might be. It's a little thinner, but when it's all dripped off like that, the stuff that easily drips off, that tongue depressor is about 3/16 inch thick. So there's a 1/16 inch adhering to that side and a 1/16 inch adhering to that side. Now there are two ways I can prime a star or a comet. First of all, I'm going to put a little dry comp into this wide flat bottom tube, which I like to use for priming. If I'm priming a comet, we're going to make some color changing, or not color, married comets, where I want to prime the flat end of a pumped comet, 1.5 inch color wafer comet. I can take a little of this slurry and just butter the end of a comet or star like this, making sure I get a good 1/32 to 1/16 inch coating on there. Dunk it gently into the dry prime, which gives me a nice dry rough layer. Typically I want to make sure that that prime layer is not extended past the edge of the comet, because I'm trying to either nest these together or fit it in a certain size mortar. So there's a nicely primed end on that star. If I'm priming stars this way, which sometimes we do with pumped stars, where we're just priming the ends of them to do some quick priming, I'll butter the other end, dunk that gently into the dry prime. And there's a nicely primed comet which will take fire and hold fire easily at both ends. I will prime the ends of colored wafer on a married comet that way. Once that's dry, that composition really adheres to the star surface. It cannot be busted off easily. It has to be cut off. But for 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch pumped stars, that's a little bit of a laborious process. There are relatively easy ways to. Caleb just came out with this nice little star roller. If you have a bigger cement mixer star roller, you can put some of these in there. Don't start the star roller yet. You don't want to tumble them dry and bust the corners off them much. But a little bit of this with a tablespoon, a little bit of the slurry can be added on top of the stars. Start the star roller and roll the stars gently for just a little bit until they get coated with a layer of the Toro, and then go to the second step, which I'll show in a minute. In this process, if I'm priming 6 stars, 10 stars, 50 stars, 50 of these stars, I like to keep the process a little simpler, and I like the controlled method of doing this priming, which I'll show now. First of all, my slurry is nicely mixed up, and it's got that nice consistency I was talking about. I will just dunk my stars. I'll even do the one I did the ends on. Dunk my stars in the prime slurry. Shake this around a little bit real quickly. Those stars are completely coated with the prime. I'll take one star out at a time. Just tap it on the side of the bucket to get the excess that's dripping off of it. Right now I've got a good 1/32 inch coating on that star on all surfaces. I'll dump it into my dry prime, and I'll repeat that with all the stars real quickly. And this goes pretty quickly. I can do 50 or 100 stars quickly, easily, in a controlled manner, not making a big mess, not dirtying up a star roller, and getting a nice even coat on each of the stars. You can see that the stars are coated with a nice thick coating, but they're not gloppy. They don't have big glops of the prime slurry on them, the Toro, what we call the Toro slurry. And they're nicely evenly coated. If the Toro is the right thickness, they will coat it nice and evenly like that. Now what I'll do is just simply tumble the stars and dredge them completely with dry prime. And I'll do that, I'll get them completely covered with dry prime a couple times so that Toro has had a chance to pick up as much of the dry prime as possible. Then I roll them just a little bit like this. This hand star rolling is done similar to this. And what I'm doing now is just sort of evening out any bumps or globs on those stars. I just do that a little bit. Then I move the stars and all the dry prime to one side of the tub. Pick up a star and drop it. That gets the excess dry prime off of it. Pick up a star and drop it. And then these stars are primed. They're ready to take into the drying box, dry them overnight. This prime layer dries overnight in the drying box real easily. And now I've got nicely primed stars, which will dry looking like that. The prime shrinks just a little bit as it dries, and like I said, ends up adding about a 1/32 inch thick layer all around the surface of the star. That's the simple way to prime pumped stars, and the pump stars we just made when we pumped the red stars. So pumping the red stars and priming them like this. This star, once it's dry, is now ready to load in a shell. And one of my favorite shells, which I'll show making in a little bit, is a colored star shell that has a ring of gold glitter in it. And I'll show the shells made in Thailand, that I made in Thailand at Paul Mulder's Pyro Holiday, Thai Pyro Holiday. That were a blue star shell with a ring of gold glitter stars in it. These would be ready to be used in such a shell, a red color star shell with a ring of gold glitter. So that is an overview of pumping colored stars and then priming them. One thing I would add is that once I have taken all of the colored stars out of here and put them in the star dryer in a safe location, I can simply cap the bucket of prime slurry. If I keep it sitting somewhere for 2 weeks, it's going to get a little mold and mildew on it. But I can easily open it up in a week, loosen it up a little bit by stirring it, add a little more to it as needed, and continue to use this bucket of prime slurry over a period of weeks as I prime more and more stars. This composition that has some damp globs in it, if I let this sit out overnight and then strain it through my 16 mesh little kitchen screen sieve, I can remove the dry big clobs, dispose of them in the burn pile, and then I can put the rest of the dry powder back into the tub of dry prime. So this is not wasted, it's reusable, but I do like to screen out the dry big clumps after they've been allowed to dry in there. I don't want them in my tub of good prime. But essentially this prime is reusable once those clumps have been screened out. I don't want to put this in this tub now and seal it up, because this is still damp from the timing process, and I'm liable to be binding all this together in big clumps or creating some mildew or mold in there. So I'm going to let this dry before I do screen the clumps out and put the prime back in my tub of dry prime.